Hello, so it's Thomas from Muscles and Nonsense. Again, don't have an introduction. I don't really like or want to have a proper one, but I should maybe get like some sort of jingle. I'm really excited today to have Gillian on. I've known Gillian for, well, since I started high school, because I was best friends with her little brother when we used to skateboard, playing basketball. I've known her for a very, very long time and have chatted. I think I chat in and out, dip in. I ask you questions from time to time about certain psychological things. Gillian is a fascinating woman. I know she's going to be like, no, I'm not. No, I know she's not because of the quick chat that we had on before. Having done a little bit of research about her before we decided to jump on the podcast, there's things that I didn't know about her that I'm excited to ask and delve into. But yeah, we're going to touch on all different things, I'm sure. And Gillian, if you would just like to give us a little introduction on yourself, what you do, and I'll take it from there, I suppose.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks for having me on. So also from our both went to school together, and I guess since then I'm an HCPC registered chartered psychologist in educational psychology, and I've been working in educational psychology services since 2008 when I was an assistant psychologist, and then I went on to do my training and qualify, and I was in practice doing that until late 2018. In November that year when I moved to the University of Dundee to work on the training programme for educational psychology. So it's now the only place in Scotland you can actually train to be an educational psychologist. So if anyone wants to be one or is interested in that as a career, it'd be great to speak to you. Within that I'm a lecturer, student support, supervision, assessment, got a lot of assessment happening just now. And I'm working through a PhD as well, trying to. And then outside of that, I live with my partner John and our wee puppy, Jimmy. And I do some CrossFit and I coach that sometimes now at Peacefit just outside Wormit. But yeah, I'm here as me. All views are my own.
Yeah, and that's... I do have like a disclaimer saying that like all views could just be personal and they're not going to be associated to either myself or... But as we said, like, there's stuff that we're just going to talk about, and I know how nice of a person you are, so there's nothing that you're going to say that's going to upset anybody. So, what is your PhD that you're working on just now?
Yeah, so it's actually around how educational psychologists use theory and evidence in practice, and I'm quite interested in how applied psychologists make decisions, because I think it's one thing to have theory and an evidence base and kind of know about the research, and it's quite another to put that into practice. You know, when you're working in really complicated real world situations. And I suppose educational psychology as a practice, it's changed quite a lot over the years. And as we learn more about what informs behaviour, I guess what influences behaviour, and how, you know, psychosocial aspects of life, they all interact. And I'm interested in what the future direction is. You know, what do educational psychologists or psychologists in general see the direction of travel in how we practice and how we put theory into practice, and within all of that also is how society's changing, cultures are changing, or there are aspects of that are raising into question, I guess. You know, how do we want to go about our business going forward, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it was kind of prompted by thinking about, I'm really interested in how educational neuroscience is, or what educational neuroscience is starting to understand, and how that might fit within educational contexts and schools, and for psychologists who work in schools, and how those things might all interact, I suppose.
Yeah, so this is something that, so I'm fascinated by psychology, and I have, my own, definition or, thought of what it is. Yeah. But it'd be great to hear what you would, because I think psychology is almost one of those things that everybody just thinks of, someone that sits on a futon thing and then, gets, analysed. But what is psychology, just, as, a broad...
Yeah.
topic or subject?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And like I say, I think it's changed and evolved, thankfully, over the years, because I think back in the day, turn of the century, 1900s kind of stuff, it was very much about identifying problems. I mean, they were doing horrific things like cutting people's brains open And then the applied side, yeah, it kind of was how you described, people lying on couches, and the idea was that the problem lay within the person, the individual person, and the practitioner, it was their job to understand what was going on, and at a really individual, we would call it now like a within child model or within person model. Whereas now, there's much more of an understanding that we need to look at the human system as a whole. So not just, maybe some of the personal characteristics that person has, but also what's their environment like? What's the social world like for them? And then maybe going forward, this is what I'm quite interested in, where does our understanding of personal characteristics related to like the more biological aspects, so some of our genetic predispositions, like epigenetic predispositions, that's really interesting, come into things, and how do they all interact? But yeah, so to go back to your question, I tend to, and it's a clunky way to think about it, it's not perfect because it's not always helpful to categorize things, is it? But I still find this quite a good explanatory model, is in the way you would have like physiology. So how do we understand physiology? It's about how the body works, how there's different disciplines within that. There's exercise physiology, geriatric physiology, there's loads of different specialisms in physiology. Similarly, there are in psychology, and I tend to think of psychology as like, how does the mind work? How does the brain work? How can we influence that? What influences behaviour? Why does that tend to happen? How can we understand that? So that's the way I tend to think about it. I think the British Psychological Society definition is something like the scientific study of the mind and how it dictates and influences our behaviour, from communication, memory, different aspects. So, probably typically people would think of, well, there's a distinction between academic psychologists who maybe work in labs, you see the EEG kind of people wired up to these caps and everything, who may be trying to understand some of the processes involved in the brain. And then there's practitioner applied psychologists, which educational psychology would fall in that camp, but that's maybe those who are maybe clinical psychologists, educational psychologists. You get sport and exercise psychologists, as you know. So there's quite a range, and the number of different divisions like that, I think there's 10 different divisions now within the British Psychological Society. It does change over time as well, as other societal questions come in to the fore. So I think there's now a neuropsychology branch, and educational psychology is one of the original ones. It's one of the ones that's been around for the longest in terms of the BPS, the British Psychological Society. So yeah, I don't know if that's, but I think as we continue to learn about the brain, this is what I'm interested in, it's sort of like shedding light on really important questions like, well, how do we know the things we think we know?
Yeah.
A lot of psychological research is based on Western cultures. All studies have strengths and limitations. There's something quite enticing about an image of a brain, or something that says, oh, we do this because of that. But we need to be pretty critical of that, because any conclusions drawn, all these studies have had limitations. They've had strengths as well. They can tell us something, but they'll never tell us the whole picture. So, we need to continue to be open to ideas changing and our understandings changing. And I say that to my students as well, be critical healthily critical of all you read and all you see. That includes whatever I say, because there will always be, theory is always open to being contested and challenged. It's just that, it's theoretical. And, it's come from, obviously, most good theories would come from a good evidence base behind them, as in it's maybe been tested out a few times, but it is still, research within a particular context or whatever, so.
Yeah. So I'm going to maybe make myself sound like a total nitwit here, but going on like that, you're talking about there's, so my opinion on it is there is the body, the soul, and the mind. Yeah. And for me, I think your soul is like you as a person. And the way I kind of see it is this is going to be kind of like, I'm going to have to go around to this and then come back to it. Yeah. The mind, in my mind, was always would be like neuroscience. So how the brain works, how it stores information, how it causes emotion and reactions. With the soul, I see that as you as the individual. And I've always, like, my definition of psychology would be like, it's looking more at this soul idea, like why you like what you like, why you make the
Yeah,
decisions, as opposed to like the whole process going on in the head. It's like
yeah,
the you part
yeah,
of
yeah,
it.
yeah,
But I think it's fascinating, and I think that like even me asking that, like, could you, like, what is psychology? I think it's like it's such a huge question.
yeah. I know, but I think we probably, by the sense of what you just said, we probably categorize it like loosely in similar ways, but we've just called it different names. So what you're calling the soul, I maybe just described there as the mind,
Yeah.
and what I described as kind of brain level stuff, you are talking about the mind. That was the way you
Yeah,
articulated
yeah,
the
yeah.
mind
No,
thing.
totally. That was
So I
what I
think
mean. Like,
it's probably.
no, on you go.
Oh no, I can't. I think that was all I was going to say.
Yeah. No,
But I think what
when
we are.
we are, I think we're
Yeah,
on
sorry.
like the
What?
same page. I'm just saying it in a less educational way or
No,
academic way.
no, and I think that's part of the. I really think that's part of the context that we're in, is that we've got a real interest in how the brain works and how the mind works and what the soul is, and what spirituality is, and how what all of these things are that are part of our experience on this planet. But we're not all aligned in the language that we use, so, and that's different maybe from other parts of how we understand humans. Like, a leg is a leg.
Yeah,
We're all pretty clear that a leg is, well, as far as I'm aware anyway. But these concepts like mind, brain, all these kind of things, they're a bit more abstract. They're a bit less, the research and everything's maybe a bit, it's come from different places. Philosophy, psychology, anthropology, all of these fields have studied really similar things, but they've been calling them very different things, as the research has emerged. So we're kind of now in a place where we've got access to all of this information, and we're trying to, some of us at least, are trying to figure out what we mean by all these things. But so I think that's part of what can be difficult about how we understand psychology, and exactly your question, like, what is psychology? How should we understand it? There's probably not one main way to answer it. But I think it's really important to be curious about it, and to try and understand it. But
well, that's why you're here.
And it's not, no, well, well, I'm interested too. But what I think, and this is not meant to be like a negative message at all, quite the opposite. But what I think we're starting to realise is that, maybe in the past it would have been the case, or, some natural beliefs that as an individual, regardless of what's around you, that person has certain characteristics, and they can choose to behave a certain way, or they can choose not to behave a certain way. But now what we're realising is that, and that's kind of empowering in some ways, because, well, it can feel empowering because it's like, well, I can choose to be this way and I can choose to be that way.
Yeah.
But actually, I think what we're realising more and more is that there are quite a number of things that we are predisposed to, in terms of, a range of things, how we experience stress, for example, or, what kind of dietary things impact on us that we're maybe not aware of. Like, there are quite a lot of things that have been passed through genetics, but also this idea of like epigenetics, which is how the genes turn themselves on in certain contexts and which don't. And yet, I think it was maybe about 10 years ago or something now, but a research study that showed, and this was in mice, this is the other thing, that a lot of research is done in animal studies, and half of the time we're kind of projecting forward into humans when we're looking at internal things. But that showed that, I might forget the specifics, but they'd conditioned mice to be to have a negative response to the smell of cherries. Awful experiments that they do in animals, but they'd sort of like conditioned them to get a shock when they smelt cherries, and they found that 2 generations later, and so mice have a natural like default position to love cherries, but you condition them to not like the cherries, and they won't like them. They'll have this aversive kind of behaviour. They'll back off from it, because they're getting this shock. 2 generations later, mice had not experienced any shock, but they found that those mice still had an aversion behaviour to the smell of cherries. So
Wow.
even though they'd never experienced the shock, they still had this response. which is really, really interesting. It has the potential to, you know, ask all sorts of really important questions about what influences behaviour and, you know, even just at an individual level, who am I? You know, what's been in my past or in my, you know, aspects of life that I have no awareness of that may actually have an impact on helping me understand myself. Because that's, for me, that's what it's all about. Like, we want to understand ourselves, I guess, in order to be able to feel a bit of control over it, I suppose, or a bit of management, knowing that we can never control everything. But if we're interested in psychology and what influences behaviour, it's quite important, I think, to get a sense of what parameters we can be working within.
100%. So I'm going to stay on the mice thing, and I'm going to start with one like a daft thing. I actually watched this TV program the other day, and they taught mice how to drive cars.
Wow!
Like actually, like they didn't just drive in a straight line. They knew to be able to turn corners to get like this sugar solution. And then they made them race, and it was pretty interesting. But it's crazy what they can do with mice. And see, so what popped into my head there when you said that is like a bunch of things, to be honest. Like that really like fired my brain. But see, with that study where they were finding like 2 generations later, these mice was it like a physiological, oh, we don't like the taste of that, or was it like a cultural, like we don't like that, so we stay away? Do you know what I mean? Because I don't know if you've ever heard of like there's like a, I don't know if it's like a myth or it was actually a study, but what they'd done is they had this pole in the middle of a cage. There was bananas on the top of it. They had monkeys in there. And I don't know if this is just a make-up thing or not. But what would happen is that if I touched it, the rest of the monkeys got a shock. So what eventually started happening is they would like rip that monkey away and be like, don't you dare touch that because we know we're going to get a shock. But what they slowly done is they would take one monkey out, bring a new one in. The monkey would see the bananas, it would try and get up the pole. It eventually switched to all new monkeys, but they didn't know why they went to touch the pole. They just knew that you don't touch the pole.
You don't touch it. Yeah. So they learned from each other.
I don't know if that is like an actual study or if it's a myth. I actually tried to find it, but I don't know.
That makes sense, doesn't it? Because I think that, and it links on to like cultural, historical rules, like things that we just do, and sometimes we're not even too sure why we do them. We just do them because they've always been that way. They're kind of like passed down through the generations, and maybe if we were to throw all the rules up in the air again, we maybe wouldn't choose to do those things, but we do them because they've become normal, and that's just what we do. Maybe what you were talking about before with your, if you wanted to say anything about it, but what you were talking about before with your dad and the kind of behaviours that, so you were saying that he raised you to be a really nice gentleman and do really, you know, and do really kind things and lovely things, I think, for, you know, take the lady's jacket and hold the door open and things like that. And that's just something that, you know, that's an example of something we don't really think about. It's just a nice thing to do. Like, you were shown how to do it, so you do it. And then all of a sudden, like, there's a culture change, or we get new insight into what that maybe means, or messages that gives to women or whatever, and it kind of throws it into question again. But otherwise we wouldn't necessarily question it. It's just what we do. So things kind of like pass down, don't they, through generations, that some of them we want to keep and some of them we think, well, do I want to keep doing that or not? You know, it's
And so that was the other thing that like popped into my head when you were saying that like if this like dislike for cherries is passed down and it's genetic, I wonder, and this is just the way my brain works, I wonder if there's like a relationship there to like racism or something. So racism is maybe not just cultural, it's like, again, I know that racism is like a, or maybe I don't know actually, is it like just a perception or is there like a dislike? Like, I don't know. And
I don't know either, but I don't know. And with the mice, I suppose the point with that was that it was about epigenetics. So mice genetically are drawn to like cherries. But the way that it sounds like their genes switched on or off or adjusted themselves was, it was like epigenetically. So the genes switched themselves in a different way to be conditioned not to like cherries, which then passed down genetically through the generations. And I don't know, I guess that could, that would be a great area for research. Like, how else does that present itself in humans? What kind of patterns do we see across community groups in relation to something like racism? Yeah. And it's probably common sense feeling to say that that definitely does pass through generations. It's like, part of what most psychologists, I imagine, but certainly in educational psychology, believe is that behaviour is learnt through modelling. So it's the classic thing of like, you hear yourself saying what your mum or dad said before you even know you've said it, or what you were talking about, like you're doing that before you even realise it. Like,
how bad is that?
There's me saying exactly what my mum would say.
Yeah.
So that definitely happens, we think, and which is why it's really important, to kind of understand ourselves so that we know, okay, maybe especially under conditions of stress or when I'm tired or when I'm hungry, I'm probably going to behave in a default way. And am I okay with the default way? Or do I want to maybe try and observe it, notice it, and take some steps to try and shift that if that's something I want to be doing?
Yeah.
And I guess racism would absolutely be something that we need to be much more aware of. Where does it exist? And where does it exist? Like, why as well? And trying to understand. And I think part of what I really believe and think strongly about, and think it's great that you're doing this, is that I think there can be a tendency, I think, for things that feel a bit difficult or awkward or uncomfortable to just sort of ignore it and think, oh well, I'm glad someone else is dealing with that, and especially, and I can be guilty of this with Twitter. I don't really use Twitter very much. I think it's a really hostile environment. And I don't necessarily think it is the place to be having important, difficult conversations, but I think we do need to be able to feel okay about talking about things that are difficult or feel a bit awkward, that we don't fully understand, that might make us feel a bit of a numpty. Because that's going to help us understand, or doing the research or whatever.
100%. And like, it's funny you say that as well. Like it wasn't that long ago. There was I can't remember what, there was a big vote, or I can't remember what it was. But I remember hearing from a mega intelligent guy. He was like, one of the reasons that this vote is going the way that people don't think it should be going is because of the death of the pub. Like, there's people don't speak face to face, and they're like, this is how I feel about it. And someone might get mad or upset and say, no, I disagree with you. Whereas now it's like, I could say something on my phone, I can put it away, and what I've said is what I believe, and it's just going to go on in my head like an echo chamber being like, I'm right and nothing. Whereas there's nobody to question it. It's much easier to not get questioned.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting about that, isn't it, is that now our phones feed us information that they think is just going to support our beliefs.
Yeah.
And that's really scary, because even in a pub, you're probably going to have it's not going to, well, I don't know actually, but I'm imagining the diversity of perspectives in a local pub. It's not going to be huge.
No.
There will be different opinions, but in terms of diversity of background, diversity of experience, it's better than being on our phones, and our phones feeding us information, but it's still not that diverse, is it? So how do we have conversations, or how do we learn from a diverse population, from diverse backgrounds and different perspectives, that kind of thing? Where do those conversations happen? And I think I think there's just more awareness that that's really important, and of where the knowledge we think we have, the fact that it has come from pretty low diverse populations a lot of the time.
Yeah. It's almost like your phone does just
studies were done in the 70s on university campuses, for example. Or, so I think there's more of an awareness of that now.
Yeah, it does worry me. I worry about that a lot. And I often think, I wish I had a brand new phone from scratch, new accounts, everything. So I would see new stuff, as opposed to something that I liked 2 weeks that they think I want to just keep seeing.
Yeah.
And what sort of, and this was something that I kind of spoke to you about before, what sort of impact do you think this sort of, you're right no matter what now? Is it like opinions are more important than fact? What sort of impact do you think that's going to have, or could have, on the world, especially with this like echo chamber and the way that they can influence what you see with social media?
Yeah. Um, yeah, well, so I think we really need to acknowledge that we it depends, you know, I kind of think about it as what do we want as a society? And this is going to sound like a really bizarre analogy, but I use it sometimes with the students, and I actually used it in practice for with teachers and things like that as well. But if you think about like a bit of hard spaghetti, like uncooked spaghetti,
Yeah.
the nature of that is really brittle, isn't it? It can snap easily, but it's reasonably strong feeling on the outside. Like it looks like it's a strong thing, but it can break really easily, and it's really brittle and it's really fragile. Whereas a bit of cooked spaghetti is much more flexible, and it's much more sort of, it can adjust to new conditions coming along. It can bend, it can, you know, move around. And if you bear with me on this analogy, because I realise it's a bit strange,
No, I like
but
it.
I sometimes think, yeah, as a society, we're at risk of becoming the brittle bit of spaghetti if we hold too strongly to fixed ideas, or this, you know, we override any ability to sort of think critically because we're so fixed on being right, or, you know, the need to be right, over and above wanting to grow and learn, and kind of acknowledging that we don't know everything, and there's always going to be something to know. And that sounds really simple, but I think it's quite hard to be in the latter, because it means you have to, kind of comes down to these basic needs of like, we want to be right. It feels comfortable and you know, it feels good to feel like I'm pretty certain and sure about this. It feels less good to be like, I don't really know what's going on here. I don't understand. And, you know, it takes a bit of courage sometimes to say, like, you know, to make yourself vulnerable, I suppose, to say, you know, I don't understand this and I'd like to learn. Can you help me, or whatever that might be? So I think that maybe, you know, going back to your question, that's maybe the concern about if we make it normal to have to present yourself as being sure and you know, fixed about ideas, that's going to make it less normal to be able to say, I'm not sure, can you help? Or, you know, I'd like to learn, or I'd like to grow, or I see this as more of a organic, evolving thing instead. But, do you know, I've been thinking about it, and if we take evolutionary principles as a bit of a basis, a lot of what we see can make sense. So it's just one lens to look through, and, you know, who knows what's sensible or not to take from it. But I read somewhere that 99% of our history as humans on the planet, we were hunter-gatherers. So that means that only like 1% of the time humans have been on the planet, we've been living in this way. Not even in this way. Like,
Yeah.
we've only been sat at computer desks for however, like, I don't know, 20, 30 years or whatever, something like that. So if you think like our bodies are, if we use that line of thought, then our bodies have, through evolutionary pressure, evolved to be hunter-gatherers, which means you're moving all the time, you know, you are moving in tribes, you feel safest when you're with other people. There probably is a benefit to being quite strong and assertive and sure, if you're, you know, coming into contact with other tribes or whatever. You know, anthropologists would know more about this than I do, but if you just think through an evolutionary lens like that, it can shed up kind of interesting, helpful things, I think, about what our basic human needs might be, and then why it can be pretty difficult to override those, because the culture and society we're living in nowadays values other things. And I'm really glad that it does, because, you know, those hunter-gatherer tribes would definitely ostracize people a lot more than we do, thankfully. You know, it wasn't, it's not, I'm not saying at all that that was a good way to live or whatever, but it does suggest maybe that nowadays our lifestyle, our culture, our society is quite different maybe to what our default kind of natural instincts would be.
Yeah.
And I think some of the educational neuroscience stuff suggests that, actually, like, you know, our brain is, it's, some would say our brain is lazy, some would say it's pretty efficient, but it's pretty good at sifting through what are my priorities here. And if we're stressed, if we're hungry, if we're overworked, if we're living in poverty, they all add additional demand. So bottom line, it's trying to keep us alive.
Yeah.
And maybe it's going to help us still try and experience have senses, but we probably all know what it feels like to be really stressed or overwhelmed, and you kind of like wandering around in a bubble, like not too sure what's going on, because we're a bit overwhelmed. So that's the start of things starting to feel compromised. Like, our brain is probably prioritizing certain things at that point, over and above the ability to sort of think creatively or problem solve or be regulated in our responses, or behave in the ways that we would like to, as opposed to the ways that are just we're predispositioned to do, which we might not want. We might not really want to be behaving in that way. So different people call it different things, but self-regulation work, some of the stuff that educational psychology services try and support schools with to help children be able to do that. So yeah, it's all just really interesting, I think. But yeah, I think that's my hope, that we can remain a society and culture that has really good values at the basis of it, so that we can keep coming back to those.
Honestly, I really hope it doesn't seem like I'm just waiting to talk. I'm like listening to so many things that you're saying, and it's firing off so many ideas in my mind, and it's getting me to want to ask questions, and it's just making me want to like converse and talk about things, because a thing that I like regularly, pretty much I say at least once a day to clients, is like, look, you need to understand that your body's like 250,000 years old probably, but technology is like in the past like 5 years or something has evolved so fast that we're not quite able to keep up with it. And all it's doing is it's doing its old regular responses.
Right,
Pretty much most check-ins, when I check in with a client, I'll be talking about fight or flight, rest and digest. Right. And I'll be talking about stress levels. And it's constant. But I do, and I think I'm going to try and remember everything, because I was jotting notes down that we were talking about there. That I almost feel like humans they know how to live or have a good human existence. Like if you read things like, and I spoke about this on the last podcast I released, like if you look back at like Buddhist monks, if you look at certain religions, and I feel like there is a part of religion, like the direction that they tell you should go, I feel like you're like, that's a good human. We already know as well that like certain things they don't agree with us, but what we're doing is like, because it can make someone money, and I know that sounds so conspiracy theory, that it continues to get pushed.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that kind of, could lead into, where is the power? Where is the power in society? What is driving societal changes? What is that based on? What influence can an individual have within that against the machine kind of thing? And yeah, it's all really interesting stuff. I think that's part of what can feel quite stressful at the moment, is because we can see all of the things. Well, some people maybe are if you're sort of interested in this kind of thing, all the things that maybe don't feel right or that we've got issue with, and we want to be able to try and be part of change and help with progress. And I think it can feel quite overwhelming. Like, I don't watch the news all the time because it can just be a bit overwhelming. And I think there's something about for us to be able to prioritize as well. Where do I want to put my energy, and where do I want to put my focus in terms of bringing positive change or trying to do something good in the world? Kind of acknowledging that, again, it's not meant to be a negative message, but we probably can't change all of the things in all of the world that we want to change. Like maybe some people can, maybe there are exceptions, but thinking about the average person, maybe that, especially, like absolutely especially when there are really substantial social, economic challenges going on as well for people. So, where within that, I really like the idea of a circle of influence. So, an exercise you might have heard about, an exercise we maybe get people to do is like think about all of the things that are concerning you, all of the things that are worrying you, that are bringing you stress, and that's in your big circle, and then there's a little or a smaller circle in the middle, which is right, out of all of those things, which things do you think you can reasonably influence, or you might want to try and influence? And that might be as simple as like, I'd like to speak to my kids in a different way, or 80% of the time I'd like to make reasonable decisions about what I'm putting in my body in terms of food, knowing that it's not going to be possible all the time, or like I'm going to write to my MP because I feel really strongly about something, or whatever that might be. But I think that kind of organisation in our minds of, right, what is it that I'm experiencing? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? How am I behaving? Taking a bit of an audit of all those things, and then trying to narrow down, well, within those, what do I maybe want to start with in terms of being able to influence or think about?
So this is like one of the first. Pardon?
No, I was just saying, easier said than done.
Yeah. Oh no, because this is like genuinely like, so the model that I use with clients, and this is something that I try and get clients to do within, like, before they even start with me, is I'll draw this this, and I call it like either the muscle building or the fat loss pyramid. I stole it from Dr. Eric Helms and Dr. Lane Norton. I stole it from them and just like flipped my own. I kind of crossed the two of theirs.
Yeah.
There's this pyramid. The base of the pyramid's the most important part, and then the higher you get to the peak is less important. But the pyramid is built on habits, behaviors, lifestyle, and environment. And I'll say to people, like, what parts of those four things, and I'll give them a quick, like, habits are just things that you do without thinking. Behaviors are probably how you respond to certain situations. Environments, like work, friend circles, like you were saying, like that circle of influence, I kind of feel like that would be a big part of that. Yeah. And then your lifestyle, like, are you a big drinker? Do you like to go out partying? Do you like exercising? Like, and then what parts of these could potentially be holding you back? And I think it's brilliant. Like, you're talking about this self-awareness, and that is from my side. And like I say, I really don't want this to be about me. But from my side of things, I'm always trying to get people to become more and more self-aware with what they do, because there's no right and wrong. There is just what you do. It's just finding out what you think you could either reduce a little bit or you could push up a bit more. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it definitely does. And I think it's that idea of it being like an ongoing process as well, isn't it? Because well, there's a balance, isn't there? I think that we probably need more time thinking in advance before we try and make any big change to our behaviour. So there's this whole field, and I'm talking about this, I guess, at the moment from my ed psych perspective of like working in schools and things, but they discovered this need for a field called implementation science, because, well, it sounds a really fancy name, but they sort of realised that we've got all this evidence about what supports good outcomes for children, and maybe I don't know about any research around nutrition, but maybe around what supports, fat loss and what supports changes in lifestyle, etc., etc. But why is it that we've got all this research that shows good evidence-based interventions, but we don't see consistency in terms of what outcomes we see when those are put in place?
Yeah.
So these guys made a science out of, these are the steps that need to happen in order to raise the potential for the outcomes to be good. One of them being, actually, to start with, we need a bit of a needs analysis. Like, what is the context that we're working within here? Maybe for some of so I'm just extending it out a bit now, but for some of your clients, it might be a big part of things for them is that they've got a really busy life. They've got like 2 jobs, maybe they've got 3 kids, so one intervention that would fit for one person who maybe has less demand on their time is going to need adjusted for someone who has much more demand on their time and who has much less control over their lives. And it's similar with these interventions. They were kind of saying, we need to understand the context that we think these would be useful in before we just take a one-size-fits-all and expect it to work in the same way across different contexts. So then once we've kind of chosen, or we've got a bit of a plan around that, we need, when we're actually undertaken in the intervention or the process to see it as a process. And it's not just like a set it and forget it sort of thing. It's like there's probably going to be support needed throughout. You know, let's try this thing. What happens as a result? Right, let's come back and talk about it. What else do we want to try now? Let's go away and do that and then come back and talk about it. You know, so there's the kind of ideal setup, but then there's also that need for coaching and ongoing support throughout as well, because it's really hard to do something difficult and just be expected to kind of go off and do it and not gather data or have a chance to talk about it or adjust the plan if needed.
That's one of the biggest things that I get asked is like, do you do meal plans? And I'm like, I don't like that because there's no coaching and there's no adjusting. Like there might be things that crop up in your life that, oh, well, how do I deal with this plan not fitting in there? And I think there's not enough of that as well. And even if you look at, you said before you came on, you listened to the Dr. Fraser Smith podcast. He spoke a lot about, like, there's nothing to see after. So, like, say a man comes to, like, a psychologist or a counsellor, gets seen to, they think he's all right, they send him on his way. There's nothing to, I can't remember what the term is, to, like, recall him or, follow up. Like, there's nothing for that. And I guess, like, in a lot of things, there's no follow up for a lot of things. It's almost like, right, you've got into a position now. They're just like, on you go.
Yeah, I know. And that can be okay for some things, can't it? And then for other things, it probably doesn't feel good enough in many ways. But I think that's maybe what makes me think about you talking about, you know, not giving meal plans. What sounds to me there is that you're trying to encourage people to think for themselves, like, what adjustments do you want to make to what you're cooking or what food you have in the house or whatever. You know, you're giving ownership to your clients. And the idea of ownership is a pretty important one, I suppose. And I guess it because it empowers people, doesn't it? To sort of see, right, okay, maybe I can influence this, or I'll maybe try and learn myself about what good meals look like or what kind of fuel sources I need. But I suppose it does depend on people's goals and what else they've got going on. It's like short term, maybe they've got really stressful, busy lives and they just need please tell me what to eat on these days and I'll do my best because I'm trying to fit into a wedding dress or whatever. Or if it's like, but for like longer sustainable change, in order for you to be confident that that's going to last beyond your input, people are going to have to, you know, want to learn and develop an understanding of what their own personal body needs. Like I really don't want this to be about me, but that's like, I was talking to Lisa about this the other day. Like there's a lot of things that go into coaching that people don't realize I'm trying to do, and it could be give them that self-awareness and that independence to make their own decisions. I also know as well that someone's far more likely to do something that they want to as opposed to what they get told to do. And like these are all things that are constantly going through your mind when you're coaching people, or they do for myself. Like, am I just pushing this person in a direction, or am I actually getting them to realize, even though it seems like there's a bit more friction with doing it, but they're going to get like the longer term results. Well, and that's quite similar to educational psychology. It used to be that there was this phrase like leave no footprints, because the idea was that you don't want to be coming in as like expert, like do this, that, and the next thing. I know better than you know, because it's not true a lot of the time. You know, whether it's for parents with their children or schools and supporting children or whatever, there's knowledge there that's really important that also needs to be incorporated into whatever plan is made going forward. You know, I might be able to give some update on research about what supports healthy child development or what's important for, you know, helping learning. And I'm using this now as, you know, a previous practice, and a teacher or a parent will know more about how that presents in certain situations at home or in school. You know, it can't just be expert come in and do X, Y, and Z. It needs, ideally, it's a bit of a, you know, it's all perspectives coming in to try and understand what's going on, what might be worth having a go at to begin with. Let's do that thing and then see how that fits. And maybe it's similar with your clients, you know. It sounds like you're saying, where are we starting from here? What can you take ownership of this a bit, because that's going to be, this is where, that's ultimately, it's your behaviour and it's your choices that are going to make the difference. But we need to be kind of reasonable about that, I suppose, too. Which is why I think that interaction is good, because what we don't want is people saying, oh, I just need to do, I need to go to the gym 5 times a week, and I need to eat 1,200 calories or whatever, and that to just not be realistic or fair, probably either. So it's it's all really interesting, but
it's just so complex, because you'll know more than me. Like we are all individuals. Like, we all have our own things going on, not just with the lifestyle, with like the way we can respond and deal with things, and that's why I love it. I love it because how different everybody is. You get a chance to see, and
that's, I think it's great because you're talking about like being interested in what people's differences are. You're thinking about the biopsychosocial bit, I think, by the sounds of things. Where are you at? What stresses have you got going on in your life that are going to make this easy or hard? What's your history been with behaviour change, or what makes that easy or hard? What do you like? What do you not like? Let's see it as a process of understanding, rather than I'm the expert coming in and saying you need to do this, 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 and this, and then it'll all be grand.
And that's definitely been like, that's definitely been an evolution from coaching, though. Like, I can remember, like, when I started like 10 years ago, it would be like, right, look, these are the answers to your problems. Just go away and do them. And it would just be like, no.
And some people might respond really well to that, don't they? Like, some people are like, I'm so overwhelmed and I'm so stuck. I need someone to just tell me what to do. And that can be enough to get the momentum going a bit. Like, okay, you can see that some change is possible. It's like, it kind of like sounds really simple, doesn't it? But even that connection between recognizing that maybe some adjustment I make or my own behavior does lead to change sounds like a really simple thing, but sometimes it's quite easy to not see that. I probably felt that when I started training again, that I as I started to train a bit more and adjust what I was eating, I was like, oh, this actually does make a difference. I just hadn't, the brain body connection stuff, behavior body stuff had just been lying dormant for years. Like, I hadn't really engaged with the fact that what I do has the potential to make it. I know that sounds like completely ridiculous, but I think if you've had years of doing things that actually didn't make a difference, or lasted for a certain amount of time and then didn't work anymore, it's really easy to just think, well, it actually doesn't matter. I'm predisposed to be this way, and that's just the way it's always going to be.
100%.
So, but thinking about that bit of influence, like what can I tweak, what can I change, and what kind of knowledge might help me figure that bit out.
So I'm going to stick with this, and this is something that I've actually started to realize recently, and I think it's why like my personal training company is doing what it's doing with clients. And I think it's to do with like, people aren't exposed to success, whether it's within their own life or in their household. Like, I think nowadays people just see that, like, right, this is how you live and you go from A to B. And I don't mean success just in money. I mean like with like, oh, I make these changes, I then see this success. People get this self-awareness, then this self-belief that they're like, oh, I can make these small changes, and then there's progress made. That's the success I'm talking about. And because we have so many clients come through that we show them, like, look, this is what can happen. This is how you'll feel after a couple of days. Like, because we've seen it so many times that once they start to see these attributes of a success, or this like, oh, I'm actually moving in the direction that I want to be, because I think that's another thing as well. And again, this is just theories of like, I think a lot of people feel anxious, stressed, and depressed because they have what they want to do in their head, but they're just convinced that they don't need to be doing anything to achieve those things. And this was something that I experienced because I've got a couple of clients that are like really, really successful, like business-wise. And what I found is like, I would say like, oh, look, I'd quite like to make a bit more money, or I'd quite like my business to get busier, or I'd like it to run better. And they would always just be like, yeah, you can do that. And I was always like, I was expecting you to be like, no, you can't do that. Like, don't waste your time. But they would be like, no, you can do it. And I think it's like bringing that, then pulling that back to this idea of like changing nutrition, moving a bit more, just doing these minimal things that people don't expect to actually do anything, because I know they're going to work. And I'm like, look, you can do these things. A lot of people do get that, like, oh, I can do it.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And I think
I think
it's
we
like
could.
celebrating. Yeah.
No, on you go.
No. I was just going to say, I think it's helping us set like goals that are actually manageable and specific, so that does include knowledge like you'll have about what is actually going to make a difference, and helping people be able to achieve those. Because I really like, there's a theory, it's quite old now, but I really like it, of motivation, which is expectancy value theory. And it just basically says motivation is when you can see the relevance of a task, like you're actually interested in it and you want to achieve it, and likelihood of success. So if you don't think you're going to be able to manage it, or you don't think it's going to be possible, despite how much you want it to happen, your motivation isn't going to be there. And it's just so simple, but I think it's so true as well, that like we actually need these little moments of success, don't we, to help keep the motivation going and help it still feel relevant to us.
Yeah, that's making my brain.
Yeah.
I know. On you go, Gillian. You're the one with all the information. I'm just going to not talk nonsense
No, I'm
here.
not at all. Please, on you go.
So that makes me like come back to like, and this is something that I'm mildly obsessed with, and I've asked you a lot about, and that's obesity. And I don't want, like, nobody. I am never fat shaming, or I have no negative opinions or thoughts towards obesity. And I would, if I could. You were saying earlier on, one person can't change. If I could change one thing, it'd be obesity. Like, I would somehow tap into being able to change that. And what did you say that theory was called?
Expectancy value theory.
Okay, so because I read a lot about obesity, and there's a lot of things in there that I think could impact that theory massively.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know that distances for obese people seem further, inclines for obese people seem steeper. So they're already getting, like, they've already got this extra weight to carry, to then have like things seeming further away, to then have things seeming steeper, and like it's going to be more effort. You can see why a lot of obese people don't have any motivation to make any change. And it's not, and like the society will be like, or some parts of society might be like, oh, it's just because they're lazy. There is these theories that match up to their perceptions that could just completely hold them back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. And it makes me think about this, like, we absolutely can't use the same yardstick to measure success for all people, can we?
No.
We really can't. And whether that's, whether we talk about groups of people, obese, whatever, it's the same principle. Like, someone living in poverty with a lot of demand on their time and their resources, they're trying to solve millions of problems, at a really basic level, versus someone who maybe doesn't have all of that level of demand, or someone who, distances seem longer for compared to those who maybe it feels like, well, that's not that long of a distance. We cannot use the same measure of success for all of those situations and circumstances. It's not fair, and it does everyone kind of a bit of a injustice. But what we do need to do, I think, is retain that principle of seeing everyone as an individual who's unique, and they've got their own strengths and difficulties in their own right, and try and understand that and listen to people, really give like non-judgmental spaces and time to understand someone's story. What experiences have you had in the past of trying to lose weight, or what experiences have you had in the past of going to the gym, or like trying to plan your meals, or trying to juggle a million and one things whilst also trying to up your step count or whatever it is, because all of those things are really important, and we can't really ignore it. And it will definitely tap into what feels possible and fair to expect and manageable. So kind of understanding what's going on in people's lives. Like, what is your world like? talk to me about that and tell me how you're feeling actually about, being in this conversation, or reaching out and asking for help, or whatever that may be.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess like if we keep this idea of what we're talking about like success, self-awareness, levels of motivation, and then if we rewind it all the way back, talking about not watching the news, like the news. I put the news on the other day, and it was, God bless it, like those kids down in, was it Birmingham, that fell in the ice, and like that impacted my day so massively that like I couldn't really think about what I needed to think about. And I don't think we should just be ignoring things. I really don't. I think they're important. They're important that we see it. It's important that we know there's lessons to be learnt there.
Yeah,
but I think like a lot of people don't get too much positivity, and I guess like that's what I was trying to like rope this all round into as well.
Yeah.
The idea of success and positivity.
I don't know if this is linked in your mind, but to me, what you're making me think of is another really simple model that I really like and keep coming back to is this. There's something called the stress continuum. Like Celia was one of the original people who looked into stress research, and he spoke of like how ideally we want to be living within a normal range of. So he spoke about kind of 4 different groups of state, I suppose. One being like the normal state, so we're ticking along, there's nothing too significant happening, demands and outputs are kind of in check, there's kind of homeostasis, is all fine, that kind of thing. Slightly above that would be what was termed EU stress. I think it's like a Latin name, which is the kind of stress, when you hear people say, oh well, stress is good for you, we need stress, that kind of stress, like a bit of stress, a bit of maybe the kind of stuff you would have for an interview that's actually helpful, or like in a competitive environment, the bit that'll help you get a PB at a competition, like that sort of bit, that's useful. Yeah, we do want that kind of stress. Beyond that is like what was termed hyper stress, which is like we're a bit too high there. That's a bit too much stress. It's starting to impact how we can think. It's, like I was talking about the kind of survival mechanisms before, it's starting to take away resources and energy from the top of the triangle, and it's starting to deplete our ability to think clearly, make decisions, that kind of thing. And then at the bottom there's hypostress, which presents differently, but has the same kind of basis. Like we're actually a bit overwhelmed with feelings, thoughts, whatever, and we need to try and bring things up a bit more to the normal range. That would maybe be, you just can't get out of bed, you're just too overwhelmed, you can't think, you can't, like walking around in a daze, like I was saying, just really low energy, and can't seem to problem solve yourself out of it, kind of thing. That would be that end, hyper at that end, and that sweet spot in the middle is like the normal to EU stress levels. And I think like part of what I guess just like being a human on the planet sometimes can feel like is trying to figure out, what do I need in my life? What habits or behaviours or routines or whatever that can keep me in that middle range and not have me going up here too often or not coming down here too often. And certain people will be predisposed to go that way or that way. And actually throughout a day, we might find ourselves shooting up and down depending on what that day looks like. But what tools do I feel like I have, or what knowledge do I want to gain or whatever to help me just stay a bit more in that range of normal to just above that, to help me operate in a way that I want to, and not just feel completely overwhelmed at one end or the other. And for some people, the news, like can actually push us in one direction or the other. And it's not to say don't engage with it, but we definitely not to say don't engage with it. But it's good to have that self-knowledge, isn't it? That, like you're saying, I noticed that actually impacted my whole day, and I was less able to do the things that I wanted to do. And that can be a good thing. That can actually shift down into EU stress, where it's like, right, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to take action. It can be a really helpful thing, but it's good to see what does that to us and to keep it in check, because you don't want to be at either end of the scale for too long, or that's where chronic health conditions can start to pop up, or, longer term difficulties. And that's just a model. That's just, through some research, some guy putting this together, but I find it pretty useful to just, it kind of bolsters on some of those principles that we think we understand now about efficient brain function and how that impacts on the rest of the body, etc.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny that you're saying that as well, because I can remember like I think it's called like the arousal continuum from like coma.
Yeah, it's the
like,
same principle. Yeah.
Blackout, like you're seeing red, you're going fucking mental.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the other two things that popped into my head there, which fascinated me about sports psychology, was it, I don't know if it was Piaget's inverted U. It's the inverted U,
Okay.
and then there's the catastrophe theory as well. Like, and it's for sport, like the inverted U. So I'm gonna try and draw it. It is like the letter U turned upside down, so it looks almost like an N shape or a hill. Yeah. And if you think about like stress, once it gets to this point, you've got peak performance. But if you stress too much, it starts to come down, and performance can go like get worse. But then on the catastrophe theory is it like curves up and then just drops off. Like there's a level of stress that you are just crap.
Yeah, just crashed. Yeah, exactly. So exactly the same principle. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like
the reason
it's helpful, isn't it, to just categorize. I find it helpful anyway. Categorize it so it gives us a bit more of an awareness of what's happening. You know, like, right, okay, I am feeling a bit flooded with something at the moment, or a bit overwhelmed. I'm going to take myself out for 5 minutes, or I'm going to take myself on holiday, or if you've got that luxury, or I'm just going to, I don't know, lock myself in the loo for 5 minutes or something. I don't know, like whatever option is available. But again, easier said than done, and not always possible. But I think the same thing applies when you're trying to make decisions about food choices or whatever. I've got a really silly example, but it just brings it to life, I guess, if I'll just go off on a wee tangent for a minute.
No,
my puppy is unwell again, and we had to take him to the Glasgow Small Animal Hospital, and I was proper emotional, like really feeling it. I was in that way, you know, I was saying earlier about just kind of wandering around spaced out. I was feeling that way when we got out of the car and went into Morrison's because we were going to get something just to pick up for the drive on the way home. I went straight to the Christmas tree shaped crumpets. I was like, I'm having them.
Yeah.
Like, if I was in a different state, I would have probably been more like able to think, right, no, come on, I'm like mildly gluten intolerant as well, so that's not a good thing to be choosing. You know? But I just didn't have that reserve available to me at the point in time. I was like, I want them. So it's just a stupid, light example. Obviously, in many situations, it's much more serious than that. But yeah, it's just, you know, we have to be a bit realistic, I think, too. By the time I got home, I have to say, I didn't eat the whole packet. I'd kind of like given myself a bit more time to...
I bet there's people listening, Gillian, that are like, she only had crumpets. Jesus Christ, like.
But that's the thing, isn't it? It's like it's all relative, isn't it? Yeah, no.
Yeah. It's funny as well. Like I've got like not theories, but like things that I try and explain to clients as well. That like you have lifetimes of habits and behaviors, and you're probably not going to like people that are just starting diet, and you're probably not going to undo them. And like those crumpets there, because again, if we could go back to the hunter-gatherer idea. Like your body gives you a dopamine hit, like a hit of happiness when you get something that's higher in calories, because it knows then, right, we're going to survive another day probably. Yeah. We've got this extra energy. We're going to be able to push on. We should be able to find more food. So you get this like, oh yes, let's go. That's made me feel a little bit better. And if your happiness is below where it normally is, it's going to try and maintain and go back to homeostasis. It knows that like, right, okay, if I have this like high calorie or this treat, I'm going to feel a bit better. And that, like, I know that people, well, I feel I've regularly seen people do these things to make themselves feel better. And I think another example that's good, like, kind of on this topic is, like, takeaways at the weekend. Yeah. Like, when we were growing up, mum and dad would be excited because the takeaway's coming. They don't have to cook. There's no dishes for them. It's Friday. They've maybe had a glass of wine. Dad's feeling good. He's not as angry as normal. So what happens is we then start to associate this amazing feeling of family and happiness to takeaways. And I think it's why a lot of people can use like food as rewards and treats. Like a common thing that people will say is, oh, I've earned my takeaway because I've put myself through exercise, which seemed like a demand or something. So I think like growing up, we get used to these sorts of habits, behaviors and ways to react to these different emotions. And that is more so like I don't have any research to support any of that, but I've seen it regularly. When I think about it, I'm like, yeah, it kind of makes sense.
And it makes sense, doesn't it? Like we do associate things, and again, it's like that was a routine or a habit for me too. Like, oh, you did well or whatever. Here's a Danish pastry or whatever. Like, it's like it's Friday. Let's have whatever, and it was food based. So I think that is another behaviour that if we don't want that to be the case, we're going to have to think about what else to replace it with. Like a transition to another thing tends to be easier in terms of behaviour change rather than cold turkey. Usually, if there's a need there, and I think it's right to it's kind of linked to the celebrate the small wins. Like, what do you want to celebrate? It's nice to celebrate the small things, whether or not it's just because it's Friday or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you want it to be food? If you don't want it to be food, what else is it going to be? Because maybe it is, you value celebrating small successes, got to the end of the week, whatever. But if you don't want it to be food, recognise that might be the habit that's been laid down in you, and what are you going to replace it with? That kind of idea, I suppose.
Yeah, and again, I'm talking from my own experience. When I diet down for bodybuilding shows, when I get really, really lean, I feel like there's less need to celebrate victories. Like, it's a weird thing. Like, you don't feel like you need rewarded for it. It's weird. It's genuinely weird. But what I would normally do is I'd give myself one black coffee in the afternoon, 12, 1 o'clock, and that was it was like a big pat on the back.
Do you reckon the reward is seeing the changes though? Because you by then the motivation is coming from seeing the fat loss and the muscle gain. Like, maybe the motivation might come from somewhere, I suppose, is what I'm wondering. It might not be the food, but it might be the changes that you see. I don't know. Yeah,
I think because food's taken away from you as well. And once you've got a solid understanding that if you eat more food, you don't lose fat, I think there is that aspect of it as well. Yeah. But I also think if I bring it back to that success, I would set targets for myself, step targets, training targets, calorie targets, sleep targets, stress, and I'd be ticking them all off each day. And that was almost you've done it all. Well done. Those little ticks almost in your head. And I don't know if that impacts it, but it's I would love to do a psychology study on prep brain and what you're thinking when you're dieting and what you're thinking when you're really lean. The sharpness that you have when you're really, really low body fat. You're pretty lean year round though, Gillian. So for me, it was maybe a bit more contrasty because I do carry quite a lot of body fat when I just walk around normally. To be leaner, this sharpness that I had, that's one of the most addictive parts of it for me. How clear your mind is, because you just, and I almost wonder if it's that survival. You are back to that hunter-gatherer. You need to get up. You have a job to do. You know what needs done. You need to get fed at certain times, but there's not a lot of food coming in over the day, so you space it out evenly, and I don't know.
And I think there's this is not my realm of expertise at all, but I am interested in it, and have some personal experience of just noticing the ebbs and flows of how body changes, but also curious about what's actually healthy, because. And I wonder how that would feel if you were to stay that way for the rest of your life. Really restricted. Would that clarity of mind retain itself that way? Or would you start to, after 6 months, a year or something, really start to crash in a different way? Or, but I do know that ketosis and sort of playing around with different diets can be really important and useful in certain contexts, can't it? And John
they talk about keeping carbs for later in the day. They do recommend that running a keto sort of breakfast morning can help brain function over the day. There was a bunch of things though that you touched on there that I would love. So say physiologically you could maintain a level of leanness. Let's say because what happens is when you start getting really lean, your hormone function goes a bit funky. So for me, sex drive goes out the window, sleep starts becoming very poor because your stress levels are really elevated because your body's just constantly stressed. You do, once you start getting really lean, you do get a bit brain foggy and you can't think. But if you got say the sweet spot, you were really lean still, you had the clarity, but you could still fully function. I wonder then if the paradox of choice, having that all those choices taken away, and you were just going to live Because you know how they say like a lot of uber successful people, like they wear the same t-shirts every day. They remove as many decisions, because there's a thing also called decision fatigue, isn't there? Like,
I was going to say that, yeah, decision making fatigue, yeah.
yeah, like you get to a point where you're like, just whatever's easiest, like.
Yeah, just
I don't know.
automate it, like make it automatic. I don't have to think about it. Yeah. No, I think that's the thing too. Remove the things that actually they're not a priority for you to be thinking about every single day. Like I've heard people say that about breakfast. Like just have the same thing for breakfast every day, and that'll remove any energy that's needed to say, what am I going to have for breakfast today? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which might free up some brain space for other tasks that are actually more important. But what I remember, what amazed me, and again, this is going to sound like super basic to someone like you who does this day in and day out, was when I started to learn that adjusting my macros, keep the calories the same, but adjust the macros, and you'll see a difference in body comp. Like that, I hadn't actually considered that before I started CrossFit and noticing some changes that needed adjusted, and getting some advice on how to adjust and play around with macros. I don't track my food anymore at all, but I did for a while, and it kind of blew my mind that I needed to increase my calories and adjust the macros, and that would, and actually ended up being leaner after that, which I hadn't really expected. That wasn't the aim of it. It was to sort of be able to function a bit better, because I was running on too low calories for a long time. Not really aware of it, just because I was training hard, I was working really hard, and it wasn't good long term. To start with, I felt great. I was like, wow, this is amazing. I'm feeling so good and bouncy and all of that. But I don't know, maybe after 6 months, a year, I was just like really low energy, menstrual cycle stopped, like things starting, I still felt okay actually in my mind, but it was starting to feel like something's obviously not right here. And I think it was that bottom of the pyramid stuff that I was talking about before, like all the survival, like keep yourself alive, keep yourself, the bottom bits were being taken care of, but some of the other, well actually maybe some of the bottom bits weren't being taken care of, they were being a bit compromised as well.
Just like the stuff that you shouldn't think about.
So
I don't want to seem like I don't want to seem like the know-it-all and like the expert and whatnot, but like there's different energy systems within the body. Like you do CrossFit though, so you kind of like wave across them. However, there's like nutrient timing can impact things. So if you kept calories were low, and you're saying energy was low, you then can't expend as much energy, so your performance won't be as high. Whereas if you, and this is what I just had to do with a PT from down at the Borders just recently, I bumped his food up, reduced how much he was training, and what was happening is he was getting like 3 to 4, or in fact I think it was actually just 1 weight session a week that was far more productive than just like 5 half-assed ones.
No, that
and
makes
if you're then
sense.
and then if you say you're eating the same calories,
but it's a classic case, isn't it, of like being smart. Like being smart with where you train and how you train and how you plan your life basically. And I have to say, like, I'm a little bit guilty. We were talking about automating things, like what decisions do you not have to make. That's kind of why I really responded to CrossFit and why I really like it, is I go to a class, they tell me what to do, and I actually don't need to engage in it too much. Beyond a point, nowadays, when I was competing a bit more a few years ago, I was a bit smarter around it. I was trying a bit harder to make sure I was getting the right energy and at different points and that kind of thing. Nowadays, I'm sort of like, I want to go to a class, I want to not injure myself, but I'm quite happy to go along and have someone, talk me through what it is we're doing that day and not have to do a training program for myself or a nutrition plan or whatever.
How long have you been doing? How long have you been doing CrossFit for, Gillian?
It's actually ages. So I think I think I started, was it 2012? I think it might have been 2012, which means it's like a decade ago. Yeah. And that was at WGA in Arbroath, so thanks to Lee Page and Mikey Goods. He trained me for a while there too, and that was great. And then moved to Dundee at FFD, and then to Sweatbox with Shelley McCoy. She's got a great place there. And now, with PeaceFit in Warmont. So yeah,
And
it's been a long time, and I think just thinking about what helped me, because I was quite competitive as a child, and then like throughout, and I kind of dabbled in things as a teenager. Like I stopped I was a Highland dancer as a child, and that was pretty intense and like pretty all consuming. And then I think I stopped that maybe early teens, and then did a bit of basketball. I kind of mainly just hung around in the basketball crowd towards the end anyway. I did a bit of basketball maybe like first to third year maybe. And then throughout my 20s I didn't really do anything, like really didn't. And you know, you're saying I'm lean all year round. I certainly wasn't throughout that, but like early 20s, etc. And just didn't really find, you know, I'd have gym memberships, and I kind of worked it out at one point. It was costing me like £150 a visit, because I was paying a yearly membership.
yeah,
I'm going like once or twice a year or something. Like, when you do a cost analysis, it's like, this is crazy. So yeah, it was definitely in that classic cycle, I think, of wanting to fit the mold of really slim and you know, that kind of thing, and just really not sure how to do it and kind of struggling. Did the Slimming World things, so felt the benefits of that for like a couple of months, and then that falls off the wayside, and then, you know, things go back to normal. But I think the difference for me with CrossFit was that kind of probably played to some of my strengths. So I've never really liked, you know, I think I was aspiring to be really slim, like I say, this hourglass figure or whatever, and then CrossFit sort of showed me that actually there's exercise you can do that it might not lead to those things, but it can help you be strong or whatever. And that seemed to probably be, without knowing much about the physiology of it, I think my body quite likes that kind of exercise. I like lifting weights. Seems to suit me reasonably well most of the time, although I am generally sore. So yeah, it was great. And then the community aspect of CrossFit too.
yeah,
You know, there are people there. You're going through hard things together, but you somehow survive it. It keeps you. It's quite motivational in that way too.
yeah. So that was actually going to be one of my questions. Were you competitive before you started CrossFit, or did CrossFit make you competitive?
Yeah, so I was as a child, like I say, but I've never really said. My mum used to say, "Oh, she just doesn't have the fighting spirit." It's like, oh, but I did compete, so I did like do. You know, I was a competitive Highland dancer, and my mum, bless her, would like trail me around the country and go to all these different competitions and things, and I did really enjoy it. But I don't know if it was the competition I enjoyed. It was more like the actual dancing, like the physical aspect of things that I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
And then when I came back to CrossFit, it was so bizarre because it felt like I was reconnecting with part of myself from my childhood that I'd just sort of like, it was kind of like an identity shift again. Like maybe late teens, early 20s, I'd kind of ignored that aspect of my personality or that aspect of my identity, and then like CrossFit was able to bring it back in. Like I actually do like doing quite hard physical things. It's quite motivational for me, so yeah, it was helpful in that way.
I guess like what I need to try and do as well, because like we've just chatted and I've not really actually like blown the smoke up your bum that I think you do deserve. Like when I looked at Gillian up and I'd done a bit of research into what she was doing, because I wanted to find out more about like psychology, what educational psychology was, and we'll maybe get you back on another time to talk about a few, because honestly I've not asked any of the questions that I had jotted down. We've just spoke about other stuff. Like you're not just a clever clogs. Like you've been published 5 times. Have you got 5 articles published?
No, not really. I'm working on a few, but yeah, I guess like different conference publications and things like that.
Yeah, so I've got a list here of things. You then also won a prize for Student-Led Teaching Award back in 2020.
You have done your research.
Yeah. And like I say, like your PhD thing, I was trying to find what it was, but that was like near impossible to find.
Yeah.
But not only are you the brain side, you are like the brawn side. You have competed in CrossFit a few times, haven't you? Like the competitions over the UK and.
Yeah. And you know, that's more. I have to say, I actually don't think have I. Well, so there's loads of ways you can compete in CrossFit. It's really accessible. So you know, the competitions range from small in-house things to like larger scale, like you say, national events. For the bigger ones, I've never competed by myself. I've always competed with someone else, like partner competitions. And I have to give a big shout out to Shelley McCoy at Sweatbox for that, because she really, and it's funny, isn't it? You get someone to work alongside you and kind of who sees potential in you, and that can really make such a difference. And she definitely did that for me in the early stages of competing. And yeah, I think we were a pretty good team for a while. She's like well exceeds me now. But yeah, I really appreciated that, as someone just saying like, come on, we can have a go, we can do it, and let's just go and see what happens. But yeah, that was great. But I haven't competed loads recently. The last time I think I competed at national thing was with another girl, Vicky from Sweatbox, and that was down in Gateside in Newcastle. That was great fun. We just kind of said, look, we know we're both not in the greatest shape we've ever been in, but let's just go and have fun. And it was great. It was really good.
That's brilliant. And so, like, so you've been in CrossFit for 10 years. CrossFit's been around, it's not even much longer than that, really, is it? It's like 12, 15 years. Like, it's not much longer.
Yeah.
How have, like, the perceptions for you being a female, and I know this, I'm not sexist or anything like that, being into lifting weights, how's that changed since you started? Because did you ever get, like, any, like, kickback being like, oh, no, you're going to get yourself bulky, and have you had to go through all that, and has it changed massively?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. Has it changed, like, culturally or societally? It might, you know, I'm probably not the best person to ask that, because I just see it from being in it. But so I definitely did get the comments at the start about, oh, don't get too bulky, and, oh, well, I want to get slim, but not like too muscly, or, you know, and I probably had those narratives before I got in too, actually, to be fair. But yeah, people would say to me, don't get too bulky, and oh, wow. I remember I went to the chiropractor, and had to take like my jumper off, and he was like, oh, you have gentleman's shoulders. I don't like to take that. Yeah. Right, okay, fair enough. But it's weird, because at the same time as that was happening, I was also making that shift between like doing exercise to become skinny, slim. Now I realise like the chances of me ever being skinny are pretty slim in themselves. Like, I'm kind of built a certain way, but as I was making that shift from wanting to be that way to actually just wanting to get PBs and like be a bit stronger, I was feeling quite empowered by that bit, which made it a bit easier to field all the other stuff. You know, it was probably, if I wasn't feeling empowered by that, it would have made me regress. It would have made me be like, oh, I better not do that. Yeah, maybe they're right. Like, you know, feel that maybe in-group, out-group thing, like, I don't want to be too different or whatever, but because it was quite an empowering thing, and I was getting something from it, I was feeling like, this feels quite natural to me. It's really hard. I like doing it because it's really hard. Yeah, it really, I think the opportunity it gives you to really push yourself, and like come out the other end of it and learn something from that experience was really motivating too. But I don't know if perceptions have changed. I probably don't notice it the same anymore, just because I'm a bit more like, meh, this is me now. So this is just how I look when I try and maintain some sort of level of fitness, and do some strength training within that. But in the past, I probably wouldn't have felt as confident to field that. So I hope that it's changing. Yeah,
maybe it's a crap question on my behalf, and maybe it's me stereotyping, or I don't know.
I would be interested as well to know. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think you'll compete again?
So this is like an internal kind of battle I have with myself, because like everything I was saying before about where do you prioritize your time, you know, what I want to compete again. I really enjoy it. I've got an injured knee, and I haven't had surgery on it, because I'm pretty sure, or I'm quite confident that when I'm able to maintain it and manage it, so like mobilize and, you know, use the foam roller, go for sports massages, etc., it's fine, it's manageable. But that is an additional thing for me to layer on the maintenance of a knee injury. But what I can't do, which is what I've been tempted to do a couple of times, is like, I'm doing okay at CrossFit, I'll maybe just go and compete. But I know when I compete, I go full pelt. So I will forget about the fact that I've got an injured knee. And that's probably what led to me having an injured knee in the first place, was that I wasn't looking after my muscles. I was just like, go, go, go. So, and actually I had a bit of a knee flare-up earlier in the year after I did the Open, which is part of the CrossFit kind of global competition thing. So I was like, you need to not compete again until you've got a plan, how you can manage your time so that you can still work the way I work, which is a lot, as well as maintain the level of fitness you want to, as well as like keep a handle on your injuries so you're not going to make things worse. You'll still be able to walk when you're 40.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'd like to, but I can't work it all out at the moment. I think I need to probably take a bit of my own medicine and get some sort of a plan around how to manage all the aspects of life. At the moment, I've put that one to the side, and I'm just trying to go to a few classes a week, and I enjoy the coaching, and I'm really grateful to M.a.N Peace Fit for being able to do that there. That's a great place.
Right, Gillian, I know you're mega busy, so I've got two last questions, and then I'll let you get on, okay? So this is probably going to go out in the new year, and a lot of people will be starting some sort of new fitness, fat loss, exercise journey. And I know that you've given a lot of nuggets. We've spoke a lot about success, motivation. What sort of advice, like psychological approaches or advice or processes or models, would you suggest or recommend that people could use to put them in a good place for going forward this year?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to that point about, I know it sounds really basic, but take a bit of time to get to know yourself, first of all. So, like, why is it that you want to do this? If it helps, think about that biopsychosocial thing. You know, what's going on in your social world that you need to think through if you want to make some changes. So, typically we think, oh, we'll just layer this additional thing on. Like me talking about the competition, actually, I'll just be a competitor again. Layer it on and forget that usually when we add something into our lives, we either need to take something out or we need to make an adjustment somewhere else in order to make that possible. So, you know, really thinking about who am I as a person? Like, what do I know about myself that's things that are maybe going to trip me up? How much of a priority is it for me? Why am I wanting to do this? Maybe listing out some of these things. Sometimes I find it's helpful to write things or type things, just a bit of a self-audit at a point in time. Like, what's going on for me? Why is this important? What do I know about myself? What's going to maybe trip me up? And then what kind of plans might I need to make to avoid the trip ups and help me have more success? And like things like doing a bit of a stress continuum thing, like what things overwhelm me, what things help keep me thinking rationally, clearly, that kind of thing. Rehearsal, you know, if you're going to, I don't know, a wedding or something, and you don't actually, you know, you're saying I'm not gonna totally see it as a complete cheat day. I'd actually still like to keep a bit of a lid on it. Well, what are you going to do when they bring out those amazing smelling macaroni pies or whatever? Like,
yeah.
You know, a bit of like predicting forwards can be useful, I think, just to help you not have to rely on your willpower in the moment, or not have to rely on your ability to make a regulated choice in a situation where emotions are maybe going to be heightened or things are already stressful or exciting or whatever. So a bit of preemptive thought or planning can sometimes be quite useful for that.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. So Gillian, I end this podcast with the same question for everyone. The podcast is called Muscles and Nonsense, and then Man.
Yeah.
And we spoke a little bit before we came on about me trying to be a gentleman, and that's now skewed and can be misinterpreted as like holding women back or whatnot. And this question is, that's why I created the podcast. I want it to be a place where people can come, young men, women can come, find out about men, can find out about how to potentially help their life. And this question is, what do you think makes a good man?
That's a good question, isn't it? So I think that, and this isn't maybe going to answer your question actually, and I should have maybe prepared for this one because it's only something I did notice you ask in one of the other podcasts. I think that, and this isn't maybe going to answer your question actually, and I should have maybe prepared for this one because it's something I did notice you ask in one of the other podcasts. I think that I think it's thinking about what the values are that you want to, and this is not just for men. I think that's what's stumping me a little bit, is because I would maybe think, well, what makes a good person? Like,
Yeah.
you know, what kind of values do we want to live within and work within? And I think part of that is being able to sort of take responsibility for yourself, I think. Be compassionate within that, so, you know, be fair as well. Hold yourself accountable, but also recognise you're just human too. And just keep coming back to like like how do I want to move through this world? What are my values? Do I want to advocate for people? Do I want to try and understand more? Do I want to be an open person who's up for learning new things? Or do I want to be quite fixed and sort of certain and sure about things? So I think that kind of flexibility, the kind being humble to know that we might not always know everything that we want to know, even when we feel a need to be seen as knowing something, it's okay to not. So yeah, I think that kind of openness and humility probably, and yeah, being able to take responsibility where it's needed.
That's honestly brilliant. Everybody answers different, and every time I'm like thinking like, I'm going to add that to my list. I'm going to add that to my list.
Well, I should have prepped. I'll maybe get back to you with it. Those are my initial thoughts.
Well, honestly, Gillian,
Okay.
thank you so much for coming on. Hopefully I can get you on again. Maybe it's when you are Dr. Gillian Horribine.
Yeah, maybe that elusive point in time when I'll get there.
But like I say, there's a
Great.
bunch of stuff here that I wanted to talk about and ask you about, but you spoke about so many interesting things there that I wanted to just let you talk, because I've learnt
It's
loads.
great to-
Like, I learnt loads there.
Yeah, same. It's good to have these conversations. I love conversations like this. So yeah, thanks for asking me on.
No, honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure, Gillian. We will try and get you on again. Have a fantastic day, and honestly, thank you so much.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much. Okay, bye. Bye.
That's it, stopping.